The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison's parade ground as Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez stood at attention with her unit. At 28, she had earned every stripe on her sleeve through 8 years of dedicated service. Her uniform was pressed to perfection, her boots gleamed, and her posture radiated the confidence of a soldier who had never backed down from a challenge, but today would test her in ways she never imagined. "Martinez," barked Sergeant First Class David Coleman, striding across the asphalt with purpose. His face was twisted with an expression Rebecca had never seen before, a mixture of disgust and triumph that made her stomach clench. "Step forward." Rebecca's heart began to race, but she maintained her composure. Whatever this was about, she would face it. She had always been the type to confront problems directly, a trait that had served her well in the military, but sometimes made her enemies among those who preferred to operate in shadows. "You're being charged with theft of military property," Coleman announced loudly, his voice carrying across the formation. Heads turned, whispers began, and Rebecca felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. "Someone saw you taking supplies from the armory last night." The accusation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. In her 8 years of service, she had never so much as taken an extra meal from the chow hall without permission. Her integrity was everything to her. It was what had earned her the respect of her fellow soldiers and the trust of her superiors. "That's impossible, Sergeant," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "I was in my quarters studying last night. My roommate can verify that." Coleman's smile was cold and predatory. "Your roommate conveniently had duty last night, no alibi." He pulled out a set of handcuffs, the metal glinting in the morning sun. "You're under arrest pending investigation." As the cold steel clicked around her wrists, Rebecca's mind raced. This felt orchestrated, planned. But why? She had always done her job well, had earned commendations for her service in Afghanistan, had mentored younger soldiers with patience and care who would want to destroy her career. And why? The answer came to her as Coleman roughly guided her across the parade ground. 3 weeks ago, she had filed a complaint against him for harassment of a young female private. The private had been too scared to come forward herself, but Rebecca had witnessed Coleman's inappropriate behavior and couldn't stay silent. She had followed proper channels, reported it to the appropriate authorities, and trusted that justice would prevail. Now she realized that Coleman had been planning his revenge. "This is wrong, and you know it," Rebecca said quietly as they approached the administration building. Coleman leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. "Prove it," he whispered. "Good luck with that, hero." The processing was humiliating. Her personal effects were catalogued, her service record scrutinized, and her reputation dissected by people who had known her for years but now looked at her with suspicion and disappointment. The worst part was the doubt she saw in some eyes, the question of whether the Rebecca Martinez they thought they knew was real or just a facade. By evening, she was confined to quarters, stripped of her duties, and facing a court-martial that could end not just her career but potentially land her in military prison. The charges were serious: theft of government property, conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Her small room felt like a prison cell. She sat on her narrow bed, still in her uniform, staring at the awards and commendations on her wall. The Purple Heart from her deployment in Afghanistan seemed to mock her now. What good were medals and ribbons if her honor could be destroyed by one man's lies? Rebecca thought about her family, her parents who had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but hope and determination, who had worked multiple jobs to give her opportunities they never had. She thought about her younger brother Miguel, who looked up to her and talked constantly about following her into the military. What would this do to them? How could she face them if she was dishonorably discharged? But beneath the fear and hurt, something else burned in Rebecca's chest: determination. She had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, had pulled wounded soldiers to safety under sniper fire, had earned the respect of hardened combat veterans through her courage and competence. She would not let David Coleman destroy everything she had worked for. As night fell over Fort Harrison, Rebecca began to plan. She might be confined to quarters, but she wasn't helpless. Somewhere there was evidence that would prove her innocence. Someone had seen Coleman plant those stolen supplies in her locker. They had to have. She just needed to find them. The truth would come out. It had to, because Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez had never backed down from a fight in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. 3 days into her confinement, Rebecca's world had turned completely upside down. The base newspaper ran a front-page story about the theft scandal. carefully avoiding mentioning her name but providing enough details that everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. The headline read, "Decorated NCO charged with armory theft." And the accompanying photo showed the building where she had supposedly committed the crime. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. Some were from fellow soldiers expressing disbelief and support, but others carried the sting of doubt and betrayal. The worst was a text from her brother Miguel. "Becky, tell me this isn't true, please." Captain Jennifer Walsh, her company commander, arrived at her quarters with a manila folder thick with paperwork. Walsh had always been fair but distant, a by-the-book officer who valued protocol above personal relationships. Today, her expression was unreadable as she took the single chair across from Rebecca's bed. "The evidence is mounting, Martinez," Walsh said without preamble. "They found the stolen items in your wall locker. Your fingerprints are on them." Rebecca's blood ran cold. "Ma'am, that's impossible. I never 3 night vision goggles and 2 tactical radios," Walsh continued, consulting her notes, "worth approximately $8,000. The investigation team found them wrapped in your spare PT uniform." The room seemed to spin around Rebecca. This was worse than she had imagined. Coleman hadn't just accused her, he had planted evidence, real evidence that would be nearly impossible to explain away. "Ma'am, I'm being framed," Rebecca said, hating how desperate her voice sounded. "Sergeant Coleman has access to the supply rooms. He could have planted those items." Walsh's expression didn't change. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" Rebecca's frustration boiled over. "Do you have proof that I stole them, other than finding them in my locker after I was already confined to quarters and couldn't have moved them?" "The investigation is ongoing," Walsh replied stiffly. "But I have to tell you, the preliminary findings don't look good. The base commander is considering fast-tracking this to a court-martial." After Walsh left, Rebecca paced her small room like a caged animal. The walls seemed to close in around her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt truly trapped. Coleman had been thorough. He had anticipated her every possible defense and closed off every avenue of escape, but Rebecca had survived worse than this. In Afghanistan, she had been pinned down by enemy fire for 6 hours with a wounded soldier bleeding out beside her. She had used her belt as a tourniquet, her water bottle to clean wounds, and her own body as a shield while calling in air support on a damaged radio. She had saved that soldier's life and earned a Bronze Star for valor. If she could survive that, she could survive David Coleman. Late that night, Rebecca heard voices outside her window, keeping the lights off. She pressed herself against the glass and peered through the blinds. 2 soldiers were walking past, their conversation drifting up to her second-floor room. "Whole thing stinks," one was saying. She recognized the voice as Specialist Tom Rodriguez from her unit. Martinez would never steal anything. She once walked half a mile to return a $5 bill someone dropped. "Maybe," the other voice replied, "Private First Class Amanda Taylor, but the evidence was planted." Rodriguez interrupted. "Mark my words, someone set her up, and I think I know who." Rebecca's heart leaped. Rodriguez had been one of her most reliable soldiers, a young man from Chicago, who had struggled with discipline until she took him under her wing. If he suspected Coleman, maybe others did too. The next morning brought a new development that changed everything. Rebecca was escorted to the base legal office to meet with Captain Mark Thompson, the military defense attorney assigned to her. Case Thompson was younger than she had expected, with earnest eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he either cared deeply about his cases or was overwhelmed by them. "I've reviewed the charges," Thompson said, spreading files across the small conference table. "I have to be honest, the physical evidence is strong, but there are some inconsistencies in the timeline that trouble me." He pulled out a security log from the armory. According to this, the items were reported missing on Tuesday morning, but the inventory logs show they were last accounted for on Monday afternoon during Coleman's shift. Rebecca leaned forward, studying the paperwork. "So there's only an 18-hour window when they could have been taken." "Exactly. And according to your duty roster, you were in training exercises from 0600 Monday until 1800 hours, then had evening chow and were back in your quarters by 2000. Your roommate confirms you were studying until she left for night duty at 2200. For the first time in days, Rebecca felt a spark of hope. "So when was I supposed to have stolen them?" "That's what we need to figure out. The prosecution's timeline has holes, but we need more than that. We need to prove who actually took those items." Thompson's expression grew serious. "There's something else. I did some digging into Sergeant Coleman's background. He's had 3 complaints filed against him in the past 2 years, all involving female soldiers, all claiming harassment or inappropriate behavior. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. Let me guess, none of them stuck. The accusers either withdrew their complaints or were transferred to other units before investigations could be completed. You're the first one who didn't back down. The pieces of Coleman's plan became clearer. He had perfected the art of silencing his accusers, either through intimidation or by destroying their careers. Rebecca was just his latest target, but she was also his biggest mistake, because unlike his previous victims, Rebecca Martinez had never learned how to give up. What do we do now? She asked. Thompson smiled grimly. Now we fight back. The base library had become Rebecca's sanctuary. During her limited free time between legal meetings and administrative hearings, she spent hours researching military law, reading case studies, and trying to understand how Coleman had managed to frame her so effectively. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had worked on the base for 30 years and seemed to understand that Rebecca needed a quiet place to think. You remind me of another young soldier who used to spend time here, Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon, setting a cup of coffee beside Rebecca's stack of legal books. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, back in the 90s. She was facing some trouble too, but she never gave up fighting for what was right. Rebecca looked up from her reading. What happened? To her, she's Brigadier General Morrison now, over at the Pentagon. Mrs. Patterson smiled. Sometimes the system works, dear. Sometimes the good ones win. The encouragement helped, but Rebecca knew she needed more than hope. She needed evidence, witnesses, and allies. The problem was that most soldiers were afraid to get involved in what was clearly becoming a high-profile scandal. That changed when Specialist Rodriguez appeared at her table one evening. Sergeant Martinez, he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. I've been talking to some of the others. We know you didn't do this. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude but forced herself to remain cautious. Tom, appreciate the support, but I don't want anyone else getting caught up in this mess. Rodriguez sat down across from her, his young face set with determination. Sergeant, you stuck your neck out for us more times than I can count. Remember when Private Williams was struggling with her PT test and you spent your off-duty time training with her? Or when I got that Dear John letter from my girlfriend and you sat up half the night talking me through it? Rebecca remembered both incidents clearly. Looking out for her soldiers had always been second nature to her. This is different, Tom. This could affect your career. My career wouldn't exist without you, Rodriguez replied firmly. Besides, we're not just talking about loyalty here. We're talking about justice, and I think I know someone who can help. He glanced around again, then leaned closer. You know, Sergeant Davis from the motor pool. She's got friends in the security office. She might be able to get access to the camera footage from the armory. Rebecca's pulse quickened. There are security cameras, that's what I'm told. Davis says the investigation team only looked at footage from the night the items were supposedly stolen, but not from earlier in the day when someone could have planted them in your locker. It was a long shot, but it was the first real lead. Rebecca had gotten. Can you set up a meeting? Rodriguez nodded. Davis gets off duty at 1800. She'll meet you behind the PX at 1830. Sergeant Kim Davis was a 20-year veteran with graying hair and skeptical eyes. She had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much military politics and wasn't as impressed by rank or reputation. But when Rodriguez introduced Rebecca, Davis's expression softened slightly. I heard about your situation, Davis said without preamble. And I heard about the complaint you filed against Coleman. That took guts. Maybe too much guts. Rebecca replied bitterly. Davis shook her head. No such thing. That piece of garbage has been preying on female soldiers for years. It's about time someone with some backbone stood up to him. She pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket. My friend in security owes me a favor. Big favor. He can get us access to the camera footage, but it has to be tonight. The official investigation team is supposed to review more footage tomorrow, and after that, everything gets locked down tight. Rebecca's heart raced. This was the break she had been hoping for, but it was also incredibly risky. If they were caught accessing security footage without authorization, she would face additional charges that could land her in military prison for years. If we get caught, she began. We won't get caught, Davis interrupted. My friend knows what he's doing. The question is, are you ready to see what Coleman's been up to? Rebecca thought about her parents, about Miguel, about all the female soldiers who might become Coleman's future victims if he wasn't stopped. The decision was easy. Let's do it. The security office was deserted at 2100 hours, except for Davis's friend, Sergeant Mike Chen, who looked nervous as he led them to a bank of monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the base. "You've got, maybe 30 minutes, he said, his hands flying over the keyboard to access the archived footage. The night shift supervisor makes rounds every hour. The armory cameras showed the entrance and the main storage area where the stolen items had been kept. Davis had them start with footage from 3 days before the theft was reported. Working backward through the timeline, for 2 hours they watched soldiers coming and going, conducting routine business. Nothing seemed unusual until they reached footage from the Monday afternoon shift change. "There," Rebecca whispered, pointing at the screen. "That's Coleman going in at 1400 hours." They watched Coleman enter the armory with his supervisor, Sergeant Major Williams. The two men appeared to be conducting a routine inventory check, moving through the storage areas with clipboards and scanners. But then, at 1647 hours, Coleman returned alone. "That's not on the duty roster," Davis muttered, checking her notes. "He was supposed to be done at 1500. On screen, Coleman moved quickly through the storage area, stopping at the rack containing night vision equipment. He picked up 3 sets of goggles, then moved to the radio storage, selecting 2 tactical units. "Son of a bitch," Chen whispered. "He's stealing them himself." But Coleman didn't leave with the equipment. Instead, he carried the items to a small office in the back of the armory and placed them in a duffel bag. Then he left, carrying the bag with him. "Where's he going?" Rebecca asked, her voice tight with anticipation. They tracked Coleman's movement through other security cameras as he walked across the base toward the barracks. At 1702 hours, he entered Rebecca's building through the main entrance. "My room," Rebecca breathed. "He's going to my room." The barracks hallway cameras showed Coleman using a master key, a privilege of his position as an NCO, to enter Rebecca's quarters. He was inside for exactly 4 minutes, then emerged without the duffel bag. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Coleman had stolen the equipment himself, then planted it in Rebecca's room, creating the perfect frame-up that would have destroyed her career and silenced her complaint against him. "We've got him," Davis said grimly. "We've got the bastard dead to rights." But Rebecca was already thinking ahead. The footage proved her innocence, but Coleman still had powerful allies on the base. They needed to be smart about how they revealed this evidence, or it might disappear as mysteriously as Coleman's previous accusers had. "We need copies of this footage," she said, "and we need to get it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Chen nodded, already downloading the files to multiple drives. "I know just the person, someone Coleman can't touch." Rebecca felt the first real hope she had experienced in days. Justice was finally within reach, but she had no idea that the biggest revelation was still to come. The court-martial hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning in the base's main conference room. Word had spread throughout Fort Harrison, and despite regulations about confidentiality, Rebecca knew that half the base would find an excuse to be nearby when the proceedings began. Captain Thompson had filed a motion to introduce the security footage as evidence, but the military prosecutor, Major Patricia Hayes, was fighting it on technical grounds. She claimed the footage had been obtained improperly and should be excluded from the hearing. "This is our one shot," Thompson told Rebecca as they sat in the small preparation room outside the hearing chamber. "If the judge excludes the video evidence, we're back to your word against Coleman's, and the physical evidence still looks bad for you." Rebecca nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. She had barely slept in 3 days, knowing that her entire future hung in the balance. But she also felt a strange sense of peace. She had done everything possible to defend herself. The rest was out of her hands. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Rebecca saw familiar faces throughout the crowd, fellow NCOs, junior soldiers from her unit, officers she had served with for years. Some faces showed support and encouragement, but others reflected doubt and disappointment. The worst were the ones that showed pity, as if her guilt was already certain. Coleman sat at the prosecutor's table, his uniform immaculate, his expression confident. He had cleaned up well for his performance, Rebecca thought grimly. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked like the honest soldier being protected by the system from a corrupt colleague. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jackson, the presiding judge, was known for his strict adherence to military protocol and his impatience with legal technicalities. He had been a combat officer before becoming a military judge, and his reputation suggested he valued direct evidence over courtroom theatrics. "The court will address the motion to exclude evidence," Judge Jackson announced. Major Hayes, present, Your argument, Hayes stood, her expression stern. Your Honor, the security footage in question was obtained without proper authorization and outside normal investigative channels. Allowing this evidence would set a dangerous precedent, encouraging soldiers to conduct their own investigations. Thompson rose to respond. Your Honor, the footage was obtained by authorized personnel in the course of their duties. The evidence is clearly relevant and material to the defendant's innocence. Rebecca held her breath as Judge Jackson considered. The entire case hinged on this moment. The evidence will be admitted, Jackson ruled, but I'm warning both sides. Any further irregularities in evidence gathering will result in sanctions. Relief flooded through Rebecca, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. The hardest part was still to come. The prosecution presented their case first, methodically building what appeared to be an airtight argument. The stolen items found in Rebecca's locker, her fingerprints on the equipment, her access to the armory through her duties, it all painted a convincing picture of guilt. Coleman took the stand with practiced confidence, describing how he had discovered irregularities in the inventory and traced them to Rebecca's activities. His testimony was smooth, professional, and utterly convincing. Sergeant Martinez had been acting strangely for weeks, Coleman testified. She seemed distracted, stressed about money. When soldiers start showing financial pressure, theft often follows. Rebecca's hands clenched beneath the table. Every word was a carefully crafted lie, but Coleman delivered it with the sincerity of someone reporting facts. Then it was Thompson's turn, and he began by calling Sergeant Davis to the stand. I've been working base security for 15 years, Davis testified. I know what normal equipment movement looks like, and I know what suspicious activity looks like. When I reviewed the security footage at Sergeant Martinez's request, I found something that shocked me. The courtroom grew silent as Thompson prepared to show the video evidence. Even Coleman's confident expression flickered slightly as the monitors around the room came to life. The footage played in devastating detail. Coleman entering the armory alone, selecting the equipment, carrying it toward the barracks, entering Rebecca's room with the master key. The timestamps were clear, the image quality was excellent, and the evidence was irrefutable. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the implications became clear. Several officers leaned forward in their seats, and Rebecca saw shock and anger spreading across faces that had previously shown doubt about her innocence. Coleman's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure as Thompson recalled him to the stand. Sergeant Coleman, can you explain why you entered the armory at 16:47 hours on the Monday in question when your duty shift had ended at 1500? I had forgotten to complete some paperwork, Coleman stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. And, can you explain why you entered Sergeant Martinez's quarters without authorization at 17:02 hours that same day? Coleman's mouth opened and closed without sound. He looked desperately toward Major Hayes, but the prosecutor was staring at her notes, clearly unprepared for this development. I was conducting a routine inspection, Coleman finally managed to. A routine inspection that you failed to document or report to any superior officer, Thompson pressed. An inspection during which you carried a duffel bag into the room but emerged without it. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Judge Jackson was leaning forward, his expression severe as he watched Coleman's testimony fall apart. But Thompson wasn't finished. He called 3 more witnesses, soldiers who testified about Coleman's pattern of harassment, his threats against those who opposed him, and his history of retaliating against anyone who filed complaints about his behavior. The case was over, and everyone in the room knew it. Judge Jackson recessed for deliberation, but the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Within 30 minutes, he returned with a ruling that cleared Rebecca of all charges and ordered an immediate investigation into Coleman's conduct. As the hearing ended and people began filing out of the courtroom, Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the damage to her reputation would take time to heal. She was gathering her papers when she noticed that one person hadn't left the courtroom. In the back row sat a tall man in a dress uniform she didn't recognize. Immediately, as he stood and walked toward her, she realized with shock that the silver stars on his collar marked him as a brigadier general. But what truly stopped her cold was the look in his eyes, a mixture of recognition, respect, and something that might have been pride. Sergeant Martinez, the general said, extending his hand. I'm Brigadier General William Harrison. I've been following your case with great interest. Rebecca snapped to attention, but Harrison waved her to ease. At ease, Sergeant. I actually came here for a different reason entirely. You see, I've been conducting my own investigation into patterns of harassment and abuse at this installation. Your case has provided the final piece of evidence I needed. He paused, studying her with those sharp eyes. But there's something else. Something about you specifically that I need to understand. Would you mind if we spoke privately? Rebecca glanced at Thompson, who nodded encouragingly. Whatever the general wanted, it couldn't be worse than what she had just endured. Of course, sir. Rosé walked toward a private office. Rebecca had no idea that her real test was just beginning. General Harrison led Rebecca to a small conference room away from the crowd of soldiers and officers, still buzzing about the dramatic hearing. He closed the door carefully and gestured for her to sit across from him at the polished table. Sergeant Martinez, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential until I give you permission to discuss it. Harrison began. Can I have your word on that? Yes, sir, Rebecca replied, though her curiosity was overwhelming. Harrison opened a thick folder he had been carrying. For the past 18 months, I've been leading a task force investigating systemic harassment and abuse within our military installations. We've identified several installations where the problem has become endemic, protected by networks of corrupt NCOs and officers. He pulled out photographs and documents, spreading them across the table. Rebecca recognized several faces: Coleman, of course, but also Sergeant Major Williams, Major Hayes, and others. Fort Harrison is one of our primary targets, Harrison continued. Sergeant Coleman was just one part of a larger network that has been silencing victims, destroying careers, and protecting abusers for years. Rebecca stared at the evidence before her. Sir, how long have you known about this? Long enough to feel ashamed that it took so long to act, Harrison admitted. We've been building cases, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to move. But we needed someone with the courage to stand up publicly, to refuse to be silenced or intimidated. He looked directly at her. We needed someone like you. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. Sir, are you saying that you knew I was being framed? We suspected it, Harrison replied honestly. When your complaint against Coleman landed on my desk through proper channels, and then suddenly you were facing theft charges, the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. But we couldn't intervene directly without compromising the larger investigation. The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. You let me go through this nightmare to preserve your case. Harrison's expression grew pained. Sergeant, I know how that sounds, and I know it doesn't excuse what you've endured. But understand, if we had intervened too early, Coleman and his network would have disappeared evidence, intimidated witnesses, and transferred to other installations where they could continue their abuse. He pulled out another set of documents. In the past 5 years, we've documented 47 cases of harassment, assault, and retaliation at this installation alone. 47 soldiers whose careers were destroyed or who were forced to leave the military because they dared to speak up. Rebecca's anger warred with her sense of duty. The logical part of her mind understood the necessity of the larger investigation, but the emotional part felt betrayed by the system she had served faithfully for 8 years. What happens now, sir? Now we finish this, Harrison said firmly. Tomorrow morning we're conducting simultaneous arrests across the base. Coleman, Williams, Hayes, and 17 others are being charged with everything from dereliction of duty to criminal conspiracy. He leaned forward. But there's something else, Sergeant, something personal that I need to discuss with you. Harrison's expression changed, becoming somehow both more formal and more intimate. Sergeant Martinez, would you mind removing your uniform jacket? Rebecca blinked in confusion. Sir, please, it's important. Uncertain but trusting that the general had a good reason, Rebecca stood and removed her dress uniform jacket, revealing the standard military undershirt beneath. Now turn around, please. Rebecca complied, thoroughly confused by the unusual request. She heard Harrison's sharp intake of breath behind her. Dear God, he whispered. I knew it. Rebecca turned back around to see the general staring at her, with an expression of shock and recognition. Sir, I don't understand. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time. Sergeant Martinez, what do you know about your adoption? The question came out of nowhere, hitting Rebecca like a thunderbolt. My adoption. You were adopted, weren't you, at age 3, by Maria and Carlos Martinez? Rebecca's world tilted. How could this stranger know such personal details about her life? Yes, sir. But how? Harrison pulled out one final document from his folder. It was old, yellowed with age, and bore the letterhead of a military hospital. Birth certificate, he said quietly, for baby girl Harrison, born August 15, 1996, at Fort Bragg Medical Center. Rebecca stared at the document, her mind reeling. The name on the birth certificate read, Rebecca Marie Harrison, and the father was listed as Captain William J. Harrison. The tattoo on your back, Harrison continued, his voice thick with emotion. It's a small eagle surrounded by stars, isn't it? Just above your left shoulder blade. Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to touch the spot, though the tattoo was hidden. Beneath her shirt, she had gotten it on her 18th birthday, choosing a design that felt meaningful, though she couldn't explain why. How did you know? She whispered. Harrison pulled out a photograph from his wallet. It showed a much younger version of himself in a hospital room, holding a tiny baby. The infant had a distinctive birthmark on her back, the same mark that Rebecca had covered with her tattoo years later. Because I've been looking for you for 25 years, Harrison said, tears gathering in his eyes. Your mother, Lieutenant Colonel Susan Harrison, died in a training accident when you were 2. I was deployed overseas, and by the time I returned, you had already been placed for adoption. The records were sealed, the adoption finalized. I tried for years to find you, but the system protected your privacy. Rebecca felt the room spinning. Around her, you single quotes read ... You're my father, I believe so, Harrison replied. The birthmark, the adoption timeline, even your name Rebecca was your mother's choice. She wanted to name you after her grandmother. He stood and moved around the table, stopping just in front of her. But more than that, watching you these past few days, seeing your strength, your integrity, your refusal to back down even when everything seemed hopeless. You're exactly the daughter Susan would have raised, exactly the soldier she would have been proud of. Rebecca's composure finally cracked. 8 years of military discipline, 8 years of keeping her emotions in check, 8 years of being strong for everyone else. It all crumbled as she realized that the father she had wondered about her entire life had been watching over her without either of them knowing it. The investigation, she managed through her tears. You said you couldn't intervene. I couldn't intervene as your father, Harrison replied gently. But I could ensure that justice was served. I could make sure that your courage wasn't wasted, that your sacrifice meant something. He placed his hands on her shoulders. Rebecca, you've spent your entire military career protecting others, standing up for what's right, refusing to let corruption and abuse go unchallenged. You did that because of who you are inside, not because of who your parents were. But I want you to know that your mother would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become. Rebecca looked up at this man who was suddenly her father, this general who had orchestrated justice while protecting her identity, this stranger who had known her better than she knew herself. What happens now? She asked again, but this time, the question carried different weight. Harrison smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Now we finish cleaning house at Fort Harrison. Now we make sure no other soldier has to endure what you went through. And now, if you're willing, we start getting to know each other as father and daughter. He paused, his expression growing serious again. But I want you to understand your career, your achievements, your reputation. None of that changes because of this relationship. You earned every commendation, every promotion, every ounce of respect through your own merit. I'm proud to be your father, but I'm prouder to be your fellow soldier. As Rebecca stood in that small conference room, still wearing her uniform, still processing the revelation that had turned her world upside down, she realized that sometimes justice comes in forms you never expect. Sometimes the system that seems to be failing you is actually protecting you. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't just clearing your name, it's discovering that you never stood alone. The next morning, as military police conducted arrests across Fort Harrison and the corrupt network that had terrorized so many soldiers finally faced justice, Rebecca Martinez, daughter of Brigadier General William Harrison and Lieutenant Colonel Susan Harrison, but more importantly, a soldier who had never compromised her integrity, stood ready to continue serving with renewed purpose. Her tattoo might have revealed her identity, but her character had proven who she truly was, a warrior who would never stop fighting for what was right. The truth, as it always does, had finally set her free.